Hello and welcome to this week's Australian Sailing Club Conference webinar. My name is Skip Lisserman and I'm a member of the Australian Sailing Board, and I'm coming to you today from the sunny West. This year's Club Conference webinars are taking place on Thursday evenings throughout the winter, although today in the West it's nothing like the winter. The webinars give presenters the opportunity to provide live presentations followed by Q&A. So if you have any questions throughout tonight's presentation, please ask away, and don't forget your name and club. Recordings of these webinars will be made available online to refer back to for those that were unable to schedule the time. Over the coming weeks, the finalists of the State Awards will be announced on Facebook pages. I encourage you all to check out the list to see the great work others have done around the state. This year's club conference focuses on participation and retention and will include updates from Australian sailing on national and state levels. Glenn Stanaway, based in Tasmania, is the head of safety, rules and representation at Australian Sailing, and will be speaking tonight on risks and how to prepare and respond to on-water crises. Glenn, over to you, and thanks for presenting.
Thank you, Skip. Thank you for a very warm welcome there. Speaking from sunny Tasmania, we've got drizzle outside. I think we hit about 13 degrees today, Skip, and it lasted for about 3.5 minutes at 2 p.m. For those who haven't met me before, I've been with Australian Sailing in various capacities for about 14 years now. My sailing background is varied. I've sailed in dinghy classes, multi-hulls. I've sailed offshore, inshore. Describe myself as a mid-fleet club level sailor. I thoroughly enjoy the sport, been around that club level for quite some time. My background started at Keppel Bay Sailing Club in Sabos of all things, and now at what seems like the other end of the world, in Hobart, sailing out of the Lauderdale Yacht Club and Derwent Sailing Squadrons. My talk tonight, as I mentioned, will be about safety. I'm just going to share my screen for everyone now. But particularly how to prepare and respond to an on-water crisis. For those of you who are watching tonight, I'm presuming that you're in a leadership role in your sailing community or club in some way. You might be aware that quite some time ago, Australian Sailing, or then known as Yachting Australia, our main focus was really on keelboat special regs. We invested a lot of time and effort in dealing with the equipment on board racing yachts, and that investment of time and effort I think increased as you got closer and closer to Cat 1 racing. In more recent history, over perhaps the last 5 or 6 years, we really have tried to shift our safety focus to helping clubs improve their capabilities. There's a lot of resources on the website now around safety management systems, risk management plans. There's also an online course about sailing safety framework where you get to learn about how all the different organisations fit together and work together, because we're not just talking about clubs or Australian Sailing, we're also talking about maritime safety regulators and the like. How staff at Australian Sailing, what role we own, the responsibility of crew, the responsibility of clubs. Great little online course to try to improve everyone's awareness, because we do all have a role to play in safety. It's a universal responsibility throughout the sport. But one role that does largely sit with the clubs is to deal with safety incidents at the time that they occur. As mentioned by Skip, we will be dealing with questions as we go. I'd be delighted if you were to put your questions into the sidebar. The course will be divided into different sections, so what I might try to do is have a look at the questions as we go. If something is coming up that relates to what I'm actually talking about at the time, I'll try to respond to it at the time. Otherwise, we might have to look at them at the end and dive back into the presentation. What I would like with each of you, again, because of that presumption on my part that you're here because you do play a leadership capacity in your sailing community, this is a conversation. So if you can try to replicate that engagement that we would usually have in a meeting or seminar environment, if we can try to replicate that here, you can't see it, but I can. I've got this really cool little questions bar on the side here. Get them in. Claire Ridgway from our Victorian office or Kate Wern from our Western Australian office, I'll get those in there. What we're talking about tonight, though, is indeed responding to an on-water crisis. We're going to break the talk into 5 sections. First of all, I'm going to try to set the scene. That is, provide you some context as to what a crisis actually is. We'll talk about how your club will have to prepare for that. What certainly for sailing is a foregone conclusion. These will happen through the sport. The only variation is as to which club or which class, which event it actually is happening in. We'll then move on to deal with what is happening at the time of an incident. So you're very well and truly in the heat of battle. How do you deal with that? And then there are 2 phases of follow-up, and I'm going to talk about them in separate sections. There's what happens immediately after, that is, you're still fresh from being in the fire, and then there's a follow-up over the coming week or 2. But first, just to set the context, what I'm going to do is display a few images here that are all courtesy of the internet. I don't know how people survived getting resources for talks in the olden days, but these are to serve as conversation starters or thought starters. I want you to think about which of these might be an actual on-water crisis and reflect on whether you've had to deal with something like this in your club or at an event you've been involved in. The first, an example of a 13-foot skiff sailing in Sydney Harbour. It's a credit to these guys that they're still upright. 13-foot skiff targets a market very similar to, say, a 29er. So it's a young crew on board there in a fairly dangerous situation. So have a little think about whether your club's ever had to deal with something like this. The second example I'll show you was the catastrophic keel failure from a yacht being returned home from a delivery trip. It's a very different situation to the first, very different context in terms of what sort of race it is, but it's almost identical in terms of escalation and does a club have a plan to deal with it. Another segment of the sailing community, the multi-hull, offshore multi-hulls. There's a lot of strong racing around Australia in offshore multi-hulls, and they've got their own set of risks that aren't the same in, say, 13-foot skiffs or any monohulls. How could your club deal with something like this? A photo taken from one of the clubs I'm actually involved in, the Lauderdale Yacht Club. I'm pleased to say that's not me, nor was I even on the boat. But does this constitute a crisis? How would have the race committee dealt with it on the water? You can see the fellow there on the finished boat is looking pretty relaxed about it all. But that's at the moment it's happening. So other real examples that have actually happened in our sport, we've had a few examples of people going overboard off racing yachts and their life jacket doesn't inflate. Now, some of these have resulted in successful rescue of the crew. They've been offshore, they've been inshore. Unfortunately, in a couple of cases, there's also been loss of life. We have had situations in the sport where dinghy clubs or off the beach clubs have had to deal with trapeze entrapments. I can think of a loss of life. In my time here, there was a loss of life in Victoria not long before I started. Again, if you're a dinghy club viewing this, how would your club deal with it? Keel failure in an offshore race. Unfortunately, in terms of keelboat racing at the moment, it's probably the biggest issue that we as a sport are dealing with globally. If you're running keelboat racing, particularly offshore, think about whether that's a crisis. I pretty much guarantee you're all standing there thinking, yes, it is. Multi-hull capsize and inversion. It's interesting. I was once told by a naval architect that multi-hulls, the offshore multi-hulls, are only stable in 2 points of sail, and that is either flat upright or flat upside down. Everything else is a very dynamic situation. So the definition that I'd like to share with you tonight, just for the, I don't think it's actually in the dictionary, I don't think it's in the standard, but it could be any crisis or any event that is going to lead to a dangerous situation affecting the crew, the boat, or the club. So going back to those 4 examples before, I'm actually pleased to say that if the F18 on the finish line, nobody ran into them, they righted their boat and off they went. The 13-foot skiff kids, all credit to them, they kept sailing, they finished their race. With an inverted multi-hull, often it just means that the boat needs to be salvaged and righted by people who know what they're doing. Unfortunately, with the keel failure, that was loss of all hands of the boat. So as we go through this, now that we've got those various examples we're showing through pictures or scenarios, I want you to think about how your club might deal with these using the existing plans and procedures that you've got in place. Now, the first of a couple of rhetorical questions for listeners, viewers. Why would you prepare for an incident? Sounds very defeatist. Sounds almost nihilistic. Can you will it to happen? No, you won't will it to happen, but you'd almost be mad not to prepare for an incident. In Australia, across my desk, we deal with probably 1 incident a year. It could be anywhere in the country. So we have to get your club to think about that this is an eventuality. Every year there'll be something. The only thing that varies is which club or which class, which event. And your club has a responsibility to prepare for that. You have a responsibility to your own community, the participants in the racing. So get a plan, have some procedures in place. Having a plan and procedures in place is not too different to carrying life jackets on board or having life rafts. You like to believe you'll never have to use it. I ride a motorcycle. I actually got my motorcycle here tonight. Wear a helmet all the time. It's not just because of the law, it's just because something might happen and there's no way I'd be on the motorbike without it. Your club would be nuts to not have a robust and well thought out incident management plan. Most importantly, people need to know about it. I think it's quite common for people to joke about strategic plans being written and put on a shelf, or risk management plans being written and put on the shelf. But that is probably the most exquisite irony with an incident management plan, should you go to the work of developing one, but not maintain it and not share it with the people. They have to know about it. So an incident management plan, the procedures your club will happen if it has to deal with a crisis. Preparing the plan starts with the club's culture. Now, this is where we have the fun talk about attitudes. What's your club's view or approach to this? So the planning stage largely hinges on that as a starting point. And I'm talking about the attitude of the club's key people. The main committee, if you're staffed, the CEO or management, sailing manager, sailing committee chair, because these people will set the tone for the rest of the club. The way volunteers engage in responding to an incident and safety, the way boat owners, crews and skippers would respond to an incident, all starts with the leadership of the club. I guess that's why they're called the leadership. Think about how important that is. So with preparing a plan, it is just a process. Get the team together and identify what could go wrong. Now, this will already be listed in your risk management plan. I've just got a question in. Your timing is excellent, Hugh Howard from the RORC. Crisis prevention, I think of as more risk management. You're putting in place procedures or rules or plans to try to avoid the problem happening in the first place. You've almost taken the talking note straight out of my slide, that what we're really talking about here is, rather than reducing the likelihood of something happening, what we're talking about is dealing with it and mitigating the impact of the risk. That really is what we're focused on tonight, that it has actually happened no matter how hard we've tried to avoid it happening in the first place. So write down what could happen. It's already in that risk management plan. And the key people, and this could be class representatives, it could be race committee, it could be experienced sailors. talk about what would be the ideal procedures to respond to that. Certainly talk about what equipment is needed. Different classes or different situations, different racing environments might need different equipment. A simple example, a really simple example of what equipment is needed is that if you're dealing with a fleet of Moths compared to a fleet of Optimus, you're daisy chaining a fleet of a group of Optimus together to tow them back to the club needs one set of equipment, but when you're dealing with a foiling Moth and you've got a rib, it's a very, very different process. You'll need different equipment. You'll need different equipment again if it's a trapezing class. What skills do you need in your key people? You want to have a think about this and have a plan to it. You'll have to think about things that are quite generic or uniform across the entire sport. Think about things such as first aid training, make sure people, you've got enough people with marine radio operators licenses and that training. But it's also training about how to use the boats involved. Do you have displacement motorboats that you use for race management? Do you have ribs? What sort of classes involved, and how do you train your race management volunteers to deal with that specific boat? But certainly in the plan, work out who's in charge. Now this is a clever plan or a cunning plan, to quote Blackadder, but you want to write it down because it has to be on record. People have to be able to refer to it. You certainly need to be able to communicate it with your volunteers or with the key people involved. It's very common and I think best practice to do this at race management briefings for competitors. And practice it. Practicing it is also another best practice. I know the CYCA used to always go through their incident management plan with their incident management team where they would practice a crisis. But also review it regularly. Now there are 2 points of reviewing the incident management plan. One is simply a periodic review that you'll do with all of your important policy documents or procedures from time to time. And we'll talk about this in more detail later, but certainly review it after an incident because there's nothing like a real live incident to actually test the plan and prove to you whether it worked or not. Vanessa from Cowes Yacht Club talks about a club committee may be held responsible for the incident and will be better off with a plan and asked to respond to authorities. Prevention better than cure, absolutely. A lot of this, Vanessa, the first priority is looking after competitors to make sure that you can deal with an incident when it happens. But the club's procedures and what documents it has in place and how it's practiced will certainly go a long way towards how your club's reputation and how it's dealt with by authorities in the case of a catastrophic crisis where there's loss of life. All of this information will go a long way towards what you're suggesting there about managing the club's responsibilities, liability risks. So, with preparing the plan, there's a whole heap of things that need to go in it. Yeah, I've got these dot pointed on the screen at the moment. You definitely need to have a chart explaining what the people structure is, who's playing what role. So this is when you've got volunteers coming in and out of an event. Some people might only be there for an afternoon, some people could be there for the duration of the event. The organisation chart helps explain that to people. The plan will also need to outline people's responsibilities. So this is a way of helping me understand what you do, but it's also helping you understand what the other people do. It helps you in the time of a crisis focus on what your job in the machinery actually is. Communication protocols are very important. Social media is an interesting beast once there's a crisis at a club. Managing who says what and through which means, whether it's on the website or whether it's in social media or through the media itself, the press, needs to be detailed and agreed in advance by the club. Dealing with what triggers escalation throughout the club's hierarchy or delegation to another party should be detailed in the plan. But certainly, if there is a major crisis, you've got to articulate what the control centre is. Where are the decisions made? Where is the direction coming from? There are, of course, things in these incident management plans that will help, and they're basic resources, lists of equipment. make sure that you know where stuff is stored. Maps of the course area, maps of rescue zones, safe water, where to take people if they're injured. Certainly contact details, knowing how to reach people is very, very important. Now, it seems like a simple thing, but make this available to them and make it available to them simply. So whilst you might talk about it in a volunteers briefing or in a competitors briefing, you'll train your people at your club periodically. But it's something as simple as having a laminated one-pager on all of the officials' boats. Have them also blue tacked in key off-water areas. This might be where, for example, equipment is stored, sailing office, the official notice board. So now I'm going to talk about incidents happen. I want you to ask yourself this question. Do you think your incident management plan will withstand the test? You are now in the heat of battle. Now, history shows, you know, this is my second rhetorical question. History shows that it's rarely the case. So you've got a plan and it's cunning as a fox. Now, the listeners, people watching tonight might have heard about the fog of war, or the fog. Now, I'm going to paraphrase what this quote is. It comes from some German fellow in the late 1800s, and he was a general in the, I think, the Austrian Empire, and he talked about the fog of war. But basically, what he's saying is that there will be uncertainty. You know, a realm of uncertainty, 3/4 of which are wrapped in a fog, and you really won't know what's what once it's in the proverbial fan. So we're going to refer to real life examples, things that we've learned from incidents. These are real incidents that have happened around Australia. Invariably, that fog does come across the incident where there is uncertainty. We've learned about equipment missing or not working. VHF radio on the rescue boat is on the blink. We've heard about tow ropes not being on the rescue boat. We've talked about, this was interesting to talk about this one, race committee vessels not having enough fuel. So once there was a problem, they actually had to go back to the dock and refuel. We've read about in reports about safety incidents where there's been a critical incident and the trained duty volunteer wasn't there, so they've had to sub somebody else in for the day, but then of course something happens. It really is almost Murphy's Law, worst time. We've had situations where the name of people on board the rescue boats or the race committee boats weren't known. They didn't actually know who was on the water. We've had situations where race controllers' phones have been turned off or on silent, so a key person in the safety apparatus hasn't been able to be contacted. Now, even if your club has a really firm handle on its incident management plan, volunteers are trained, they're well briefed, all the equipment is in place, everyone is on deck, it's entirely possible, especially if there's a catastrophic incident where there's evidently loss of life, the authorities will take over and they might do it differently to what you're used to. And you may see the incident getting managed in a way that is completely different to what your incident management plan would have otherwise said. And then there is the beauty of the internet. The internet will take a life of its own. People will learn about the incident through watching AIS or listening to the radio traffic. Boats often have social media on board their own boat because they're all connected and they've all got computers and tablets on board. Managing the communications, you might have a communications plan on board at your club, but we can assure you to brace yourself when comms take a life of their own. However, fortunately, immediately after an incident, we think what are the first things? Training will kick in. If your volunteers are trained, if your staff are trained, if you're fortunate enough to have staff, that training will kick in because that's basically how it works. And the people in charge of the club will start to apply that leadership role that they're there to do. It's almost an innate personality trait where they just will do it. However, keep in mind that you may have to think about it on the fly and you'll have to make it work as best you can. If the plan cannot be applied as it's written, we have to implore you to trust the people, to rely on their training, and trust the leadership people to deal with it flexibly. An example that we've actually seen from a fairly recent incident where the PLBs weren't working for various technical reasons I won't bore you with now because this isn't a marine electronics course. The people involved in the water, were trying to use their PLBs, but for various reasons couldn't get them to operate properly. Bit of lateral thinking and quick thinking, and I don't know how they got away with it, but they actually ended up just using their mobile phone to call for help. It's not in any search and rescue authority's plan, but it worked. Now, moving on to the first of the two phases of follow-up, what are the first things to do? First things to do immediately after the incident. Now, when I talk about immediately after the incident, perhaps I might pitch a scenario where something's happened in the afternoon. Just say it's only a day race, it's club championship on a Saturday or Sunday afternoon, or a twilight race midweek. Something's just happened there, and it's now a few hours later of the same day. Now, don't let anyone leave. Get whoever was on duty and get the club's leadership together, organised, and get them talking. One of the club's immediate focuses needs to be caring about the community. Speak with the people involved and reach out to them. Now, when I say speak to them, I want to stress here, be very, very careful about the role of the police. If somebody has died, if there's been a loss of life in the incident, just keep in mind that invariably around Australia, notifying next of kin is the job of the police. So be very, very careful with the communications plan and about reaching out to people. If you're going to reach out to the families of the boats involved, the crew on those boats, be super cautious around the role of police and next of kin. Now, talk about counselling and support. Now, when we talk about counselling and support, we're not talking just about crews, we're also talking about the committees and volunteers at the club, because there's always a tight-knit community. There's a fabric of people at the club. Most people are friends, and most people have been friends for a long, long time. So it's also about the people off the water, the people involved in the incident. Communicating with club stakeholders, we're very conscious that sport sailing particularly is very, very grateful when sponsors are involved, or when there's a club stalwart, you might have a club patron. Make sure those people know what's going on should they receive questions or see something in the media. Now, a statement on the website and the social media, carefully crafted statement, it's better that your club manage the narrative. Your club can make its statement, because if you don't make a statement, we do not advocate radio silence under any situation. If you don't make a statement, the internet will take a life of its own and make up its own story. You'll also may get the commercial media outlets, or the ABC, which I guess we can loosely say is commercial. The media outlets will also demonstrate interest in anything either on a slow news day or where police search and rescue have been invoked. Now, just thinking back to where you had a plan, you've planned for this. You've got a media plan, you know how to structure a message, you know who's going to be control and be the spokesperson, and you know through what mediums they're going to deliver it. Because the media interest is there. Now, these are two very real examples from incidents that have happened in Australia. Earlier this year, a person did die on Moreton Bay in Queensland. The Courier Mail local radio were onto it straight away. The club involved did a great job dealing with the media, but they did everything that we're espousing here. They had a carefully constructed statement, and it went out through the proper channels, and it managed the public narrative. Also in Western Australia a few years ago, there was a lot of media interest in the loss of, very tragic loss of 2 lives there. The clubs involved in that race did an excellent job in managing media interest. Now, after the incident's been, it's taken place, it's been dealt with at the time, and there's been that immediate follow-up on the day, maybe the next week or so, There are things to do over the next week, 2 weeks, or maybe even the next month or so. It's really, really important that your club not lose sight of the ball. You don't mind me mixing my sports. After an incident, there is a follow-up. Now, first and foremost, we want your club or your class association to take responsibility for reviewing the incident. You do this for a couple of reasons, maybe many reasons. But first of all, you have to learn from the incident. You have to work out what did work and what didn't work. You may have to go back and review your own procedures and plans. You might have to get different equipment. You might have to manage the club differently. There is nothing like the review of a black box, the black box recorder, a real incident. There's nothing like a review of one of those to help you learn on what you could be doing, because until this time, everything's hypothetical. Now, this is one of the reasons why Australian Sailing and World Sailing both have regulations mandating compulsory incident reviews for a significant incident. Now, I'll describe in a few minutes what that sort of incident might be. But sailing has to take responsibility for itself and see that these reviews are conducted, because what happened at your club could have been just as easily applicable to any one of another 24 or even 100 clubs in Australia. It's really important that they have an opportunity to learn what you learned. So it's not just about your own procedures, for the good of the sport generally. Now, one of the reasons for reviewing the incident is also because the police might get involved. They might come and ask 100 questions. What we found is that they will ask questions. They will ask questions about what Vanessa talked about. They will ask questions about what Hugh Howard talked about from the Rourke and the Cowes Yacht Clubs, respectively. That they will come and ask about what your procedures were. They will come and ask what your qualifications or training were, what your role in the club is. They will talk about how you managed it. So it's very, very important that immediately after an incident, you get the team together and you describe, you get it written down what happened so you can deal with these issues later on. Your state maritime regulator might require a report, and if they do, that's great, because you're going through that process now. A couple of other things that might serve as a distraction. I'm going to give you a very, very strong advice or request from Australian Sailing on this. If a coroner is conducting an inquest, it does not stop you from looking into your own practices and procedures, and it does not stop your club from helping the sport more broadly. We strongly advocate that don't get distracted by the coroner. Keep your eyes on the ball, or out of the boat perhaps. Keep your eyes out of the boat, watch where you're going, and keep looking into your own practices. Another one is about insurers. Insurers will likely be finding information wherever they can, and that's okay, that's their job. But again, don't get distracted by what the insurers are up to. Do not get distracted by the fear of litigation. Get involved, take responsibility for the event, and conduct a review. Now, just looking at, I've got Vanessa Twig. Oh, that was you, Vanessa Twig. Lovely to be speaking with you. We're talking about a statement from the club needs to be factual. This is going back to the communications. Absolutely. It's brief, it's factual, it's not speculating, and it's not offering any opinions on what might have happened. Conducting a review, we'll get to that in a moment. And Peter Merritt, g'day Peter, lovely to be speaking with you as well. The requirement to conduct a review is in the special regulations. It was an amendment that was issued late last year and has been promulgated on our website. So, but back to topic here. Following up after an incident during review, do it for your own needs, do it for the sport's needs. It helps the police, it helps the maritime regulators, it does indeed help the coroner. Take responsibility for it. There's not a review that's been done and circulated and made available for the sport that hasn't helped. So when you're playing this role and reviewing the incident, what you actually do might be scalable depending on the incident. You might actually just produce a one-pager. It might be something, it might be a tome. But importantly, it has to be produced independently. Now that gets back to Vanessa Twig's comments. Produced independently. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean a person on the review panel might not be a member of a club or the like, but they shouldn't be a party with a significant interest in the findings. So the race committee shouldn't be involved, but we have seen reviews that have been done by past commodores of that club, and that's okay. We certainly also suggest that the people have some relevant expertise, some knowledge on the subject at hand. Importantly though, first and foremost, it needs to outline the facts. It needs to report those for the reader. Once you've got factual reports, factual information there in the report, it enables your club to, I guess, draw conclusions. Now, I've got a background in protest committees, so it's something that resonates with me. When we're taught to do protest committees, the lesson we get is write the facts down first. Don't focus or worry about anything else until you've got the facts listed out, because what that will do is almost steer your conclusions. No matter what you previously thought, you'll almost be compelled to draw the following conclusions. Once you've formed your observations and formed some opinions, you might find that your review will make some recommendations. They could be internally facing, they could be external to the sport more broadly. It could end up being something in our policies or our safety procedures. Could be something for the SSC training, could be something for our instructor training. But importantly, we really don't know if you don't do the review and make it available. Bronwyn, I'm presuming it's a great woman, Bronwyn Ridgway. Just before I introduce Bronwyn's comment, Bronwyn's been one of the volunteers who has contributed prolifically into this space, and we're very grateful for your time there, Bronwyn. A lot of the resources that we've got on our website for the viewers of tonight actually come from work that Bronwyn's done with our staff in the past. Bronwyn comments that reviews, etc., are very much a part of the Occupational Health and Safety Acts in most states. That's very correct. I'd like to believe it should be driven by self-practice. I'd be very disappointed to learn that a club only wanted to do this, or willing to do this, because it was a legal compulsion. Really what's driving this for me is a moral imperative that for the good of your club or for the good of the sport, what it does, it closes the loop. This is what takes us right back to the start of the plan. Now, it doesn't matter whether it's Australian sailing safety policies and regulations or whether it's your club's procedures on how to operate a particular rib or deal with a particular class. By doing this review, forming some opinions based on the fact, making those recommendations, takes us right back to the beginning and starts that loop again of developing a plan. Now, incident reviews. I talked a couple of times here tonight about reporting incidents to Australian Sailing. I want to stress no one is being a dobber. What reporting incidents to Australian Sailing enables, it means that we can take these issues and share them with the sport broadly, both within Australia but even internationally, depending what the issue is. It enables us to reflect on our own training programs that educate volunteers or officials. It enables us to managing our own policies, our own resources and our own regulations. Now, the sorts of things that we want to know about are listed here. If there's a serious injury or a fatality, particularly, we should know about it. We need to know about it. Now, a serious injury might include also the resuscitation of somebody. If you've got some dinghy racing or a trapeze entrapment, and it might be a successful rescue that required resuscitation, we still want to know about that. If there's a loss of the boat, if there's a sinking or the boat's lost at sea, we need to know about that. It could also be catastrophic failure of the hull. Things we're particularly interested in at the moment include keel failure, but also rudder fin failure. The reason why these things are important to us, even though rudder fin failure, the loss of a rudder, might not seem that big a crisis because the boat was, made their way back to shore under their improvised steering system. By doing a review, even if it's just a one-pager, by doing a review, reporting some facts, making some conclusions and a recommendation, that's the sort of thing we can take to the international standards organisations. And for those keen listeners out there, you'll be pleased to know that it's ISO 12215, which addresses hull construction standards. If we're not getting this feedback, we can't close that feedback loop. We're talking about anything that might have involved the water police or the search and rescue. Now, I don't mean a false alarm through an EPIRB, or I don't mean something that was no problem. I mean a genuine rescue by the water police. We do see these from time to time. If something has caused your club severe reputational damage or reputational damage to their sport, now I don't mean just getting media attention. An incident might get media attention. It might be a slow news day and they all might get out there. What I'm talking about are safety incidents where the media and the general public are critical about what happened when they've gotten a reasonable report on the matter. They're the sorts of things we should learn from. Now, the quiet lurker here is actually if there's been a significant failure of your club's risk management plan or safety management system, or indeed your incident management plan, we need to learn from that, because that's what help us educate other clubs. It'll help your club close that loop of self-improvement. And of course, a near miss, particularly the first three, where if it weren't for just millimeters or inches, as we like to talk about in sport, if we were that close but it just didn't happen, we probably should learn about that as well. So as I start to reach closure tonight, I just want to summarise what the key points are that we want you to take away from tonight. 1, assume something will happen, because it does happen every year across Australia. Assume something will happen. It could just as easily be your club, so have an incident management plan in place. When there is a safety incident at your club and there is a bit of a crisis and it is in the fan, deal with the incident according to that plan, because this is what you've prepared for, what your people have trained for. Immediately after the plan, focus on looking after your people involved on the boat or in the fleet, people involved in the club who dealt with it. People can be affected by things in different ways. Write things down straight after the incident, because if the police have to come and ask questions, or the insurer or coroner want to ask you questions about the incident, it's not very good to try to come back to this, weeks or a month afterwards. And then, as I said, after the dust has settled, the club is starting to get back to normal. Review what happened, submit your reports with Australian Sailing if need be, or even just circulate it. If it's only a minor crisis, minor incident, circulate it within the club and review what you need to do. Now, Skip Listerman, the moderator, has said to me, if in doubt, call your regional manager for advice. Absolutely. I've just got on the slide here, there's plenty of information on our website. On the Sailing Resources website, there is information about risk management, safety management systems, incident management plans. It's all there. There's also a library of existing incident reports. If you want to, if even for a moment you're doubting the value of doing these reports and that the work involved is worth it, go and read some of these reports, and they are an eye-opener as to what sailors or clubs or even people like us at national authorities can learn from a report well done. Now, as Skip says, who to contact if in help? Contact your regional manager. It doesn't matter where your club is in Australia, whether it's in Gove or anti-clockwise all the way around to, who would that be up there? Probably Yorkeys Knob would be our northernmost on the eastern seaboard. Your regional manager knows where all this stuff is and they can help your club get excited about it. But of course, you're also very welcome to contact me. There is information on the World Sailing website as well. Now, I'm just going to turn off the screen sharing, and I have to say I'm incredibly relieved that the loss of my voice was only for a moment or two. Don't know how my children and beautiful wife would have coped if I went home and couldn't talk. If anyone has any last questions, Howard, thank you very much for your thank you note. It was a delightful rollick through the subject matter there. Thank you, I appreciate that. And Alistair, thank you very much for your kind compliment. Now, this will be recorded, I think, and at this juncture, I'm actually going to hand back over to the great man, Skip Lisserman, one of Australia's America's Cup heroes.
Thank you, Glenn, for sharing this very important information. As Glenn mentioned, you can find more information on the Australian Sailing Resources page. Our club page includes information on safety, grants and funding, infrastructure, member protection and much more. Join us next week for the updates from the Australian Sailing from our regional managers, and thanks again and see you next week.